Hey everyone, what's up and welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Liz, and today we're going to be discussing the Storyville Slayer. Now, this is another unidentified serial killer that we're going to be discussing. This one is very, very interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of deaths in this one, just like the Atlanta Ripper, just like Dr. No. Like, how these are still fully unsolved is beyond me, but let's get into it. So, from 1991 to 1996, there was a serial killer on the loose in New Orleans. Now, this killer would murder at least 24, but it could be as high as 28. Now, of those 28, most of them were either sex workers or they were addicts, but most of them were women. To be precise, 23 of them were women, 4 were transsexuals, and 1 is still of an unknown gender. All of these victims were either strangled or suffocated to death. And then the modus operandi of this case is that the assailant was basically targeting girls or women between the ages of 17 to 42, but they were also of African American descent as well. Now, most of these victims were found strangled to death, but some were found beaten and drowned, and this would be in either rivers, canals, or they would be dumped in those rivers or canals or swamps near highways that bordered Lake Pontchartrain, and specifically on the western shore of Lake Pontchartrain. Now, it is said that there is isolated locations to where these dumping sites were, and that these victims were left for several weeks or several years at a time. And this would obviously and unfortunately hinder the identification of some of these victims, but also it would destroy any evidence that would remain on these bodies as well. So obviously we've learned that with serial killers, there seems to be some type of an escalation. Well, let's go back to the summer of 1991. We're going back here because a girl by the name of Brenda, and this is the name she's given for her testimony that she gave to police sometime in July, that a man in Algiers, Louisiana, gave her a ride. During this ride, he then strangled her into unconsciousness and then dropped her off on the streets. Now, with this testimony she gave, she was also able to describe this man as being very muscular, well-dressed, middle-aged, and a black man that drove either a Buick Regal or a Chevrolet Monte Carlo that was dark colored. She was very specific about her rendering of who this man was. Now, my opinion is that the Storyville Slayer possibly picked up Brenda, thinking it was somebody that he wanted, someone that he believed fit his fantasy victim, but when he was in the act of strangling her, something didn't feel right to him, and this is why he didn't kill her. And that's just my opinion about why he didn't kill her, but everybody has their own opinion and the right to their own opinion. But it wouldn't be long before the body trail started. A 17-year-old Danielle Britton was found in a ditch not too far from where Brenda was taken from. This was on August 4th of 1991. Now, Danielle was covered with a garbage bag, and her autopsy confirmed that she was strangled and then beaten to death. Danielle had recently just stopped going to school before she met her demise, and she had no ties to drug use or prostitution. I will have, just a disclaimer, I will say whether or not these victims had a tie to prostitution or to drug use when I talk about them. About a month later, the body of 21-year-old Tyra Tassine was discovered. She was a young mother that was determined to have had a past with drug possession, of which drug use was not ruled out. 18 days after the discovery of Tyra Tassine, this is when the body of 28-year-old Charlene Price was found in New Orleans Park, which was just 1 mile from where Danielle Britton was found. Her autopsy determined that she, in fact, was a drug addict because of, residual in her body, but there was no underlying history for her of sex work. The body of 37-year-old Regina Oko was found on November 21st of 1991. She, just like Tyra, was a young mother, also of 3 children, who had a record. But with Regina's record, it also involved multiple arrests for prostitution in her lifetime. Her autopsy was conducted, and it was determined that at the time of her death, she was under the influence of quite a large amount of cocaine, which could have caused an overdose, but that she was in fact killed via strangulation. Jane Doe, number 1, in this case would be discovered on December 14th in a ditch near the highway. This set of skeletal remains is believed to belong to a younger African American girl, of which was most likely in her 20s at the time of her death. Now, even with some defining characteristics, like she had protruding teeth, specifically her front teeth were protruding, she was not identified, and it is presumed that she was strangled to death. She too was also found not too far from where Danielle Britton was found. 29-year-old Lydia Madison was found on January 4th, 1992, in a ditch that was underneath a highway overpass. Lydia's cause of death was determined to be strangulation, but that wasn't all. They looked into her past, and police then found that she was arrested several times for drug possession and also prostitution. A few months after this discovery, with no bodies being found, it would change on June 2nd. So we went from January all the way to June. So there's quite a time jump. This is when the body of George Williams was found. But with George Williams is a little different. So George Williams was a transsexual. And most likely when George was killed, he was still in his garb, if you will. Now, he was found in the La Branche wetlands of St. Charles Parish. Police determined that he worked as an exotic dancer at a New Orleans nightclub. And just like many of our previous victims, he was arrested for drug possession, but also arrested for robbery as well. 33-year-old Noah Filson was found on July 25th in the waters of a canal that was near the I-55. Just like Williams, Filson was also transsexual and worked at a nightclub with the name of Brenda Bewitch. 29-year-old Regator Martin was discovered on September 21st in the waters near a highway. She, too, also had previous arrests and was a poverty-stricken mother that was engaging in prostitution to be able to make some means from her family. Another set of skeletal remains would be discovered in a canal near Hahnville in February of 1993, specifically on the 20th of February. This was determined to be the remains of 30-year-old Cheryl Lewis. Just like some of our previous victims, she was also a mother who was arrested several times, and she also used sex work as a means to provide. She too was strangled to death. Now, when police were investigating her death, it was learned that she was last seen on February 2nd getting into a car of a white male. The day after Cheryl Lewis was found, the body of 42-year-old Dolores Mack was discovered in the canal waters near a highway. She was found not too far from where Cheryl was discovered as well. Strangulation was the cause of death, but she had no known former history of drug use or of prostitution. Another set of skeletal remains was found in St. John the Baptist Parish on February 5th of 1994. This set was later determined to be about 25 to 35, and she was strangled to death. She was dubbed as Jane Doe number 2. Now, 5 days after the discovery of Jane Doe number 2, another 2 sets of skeletal remains were discovered. Now, these remains were found in the canals as well. Now, due to the extreme state of decomposition, it is nearly impossible for them to identify them. So they simply have the names or titles Jane Doe number 5 and John Doe number 1. On July 3rd, the body of 32-year-old Michelle Foster was discovered. Now, she had just gone missing just a few days before her body was discovered. Flash forward to October 19th, another set of skeletal remains would be discovered near Bridge City in a wooded area. This set of remains was determined to belong to 28-year-old Stephanie Brown, and it also was determined that she had no prior record. She had no record of drug use or of prostitution. The remains of 29-year-old Wanda Ford was found in a swamp area near the I-55 on January 22nd of 1995. This young mother of 3 was looked into, and police discovered that she was arrested on multiple occasions for theft and did have a drug addiction, unfortunately. 39-year-old Sandra Warner would be discovered next on January 23rd in St. John the Baptist Parish. Now, just 2 days after the discovery of her body, the remains of 25-year-old Henry Calvin was found. He had been missing for months prior to being discovered. About 2 months following the discovery of 3 different bodies back to back, the police then would discover another set of skeletal remains under an overpass in Tangipahoa Parish. This was determined to be a female, but police again were unable to identify her. She was estimated to be anywhere between the ages of 25 to 35. And following this discovery, there was 2 more sets of remains that would be discovered in a swampy area near the I-55 on April 30th. There is some discrepancy. Some people say May 1st. So anywhere between April 30th and May 1st is when these bodies were discovered. Now, these women would be identified as Karen Ivester and Sharon Robinson. They were 30 and 28 years old. Karen was strangled to death, but Sharon was strangled and beaten before ultimately being drowned to death. There was water in her lungs. 39-year-old Sandra Williams would be found on May 6th. She was strangled to death. And according to police, the murderers kind of stopped following her death, but there was one final body discovered. And this body would be discovered on April 8th. Well, it says it was on April 8th of 1996. So it would be an entire year after the discovery of Sandra Williams that 39-year-old Lola Porter would be found. Now, Lola Porter went missing in 1992, and her remains weren't found until 1996. So this slayer in particular gave the police a run for their money. Now, police did put a task force together in 1995 that worked with the FBI with hopes of solving these murders, but the furthest they've realistically got to giving us a conclusion to this is that there was 2 suspects. These are Victor Grant and Russell Elwood. Now, Victor Grant was a native to New Orleans, and he grew up in the Algiers area and in an area where a bulk of the victims lived in or were abducted from. Now, Victor, he became a police officer in 1980, and he spent a lot of time in the red light districts. He got to know a lot of the pimps and prostitutes and just the people that in the transients that lived in this area. And with these relationships, he would then acquire a lot of these people as his informants. Now, in the early 90s, he earned the reputation as being a corrupt police officer. This was after a numerous amount of his informants let out that he was running a racketeering operation. And it's also during this time it came out that Sharon Robinson, one of our victims, was actually his roommate. There was a police report that was filed by Sharon because apparently Victor punched her and broke her nose. After this report, Victor is interrogated by police, and he just straight up denies this accusation, but his admission of Sharon hitting her nose on a chair was completely refuted by the ER staff, who said that the injuries on Sharon was due to being beaten. Following this, he was called to the disciplinary panel to determine his own punishment. And during his hearing, Sharon was supposed to be the key witness, but she was already dead. So, yeah, they believed that Victor killed Sharon and Karen to get rid of any evidence or a witness to a crime that he committed. So, in order for the police to determine whether or not he was in fact the killer of Sharon, the killer of Sharon and Karen, they were chewing tobacco, and they ended up spitting out a piece. So, with that piece, they ended up extracting saliva that was on it. So they decided to do a DNA profile and see if Victor's matched that was found on the chewing tobacco, but unfortunately it was inconclusive and no charges were filed against Victor. But he did lose his job, so I guess that's a good thing. Russell Elwood came under the radar in 1994, and this is because he was caught masturbating in his car. But it's not the act of what he was doing that caught police's attention. He was parked near where Cheryl Lewis and Dolores Mack were found. Now, Russell was partially undressed when they forced him out of the car, and they told him he needed to hand over his identification, so they knew who he was. Now, he apparently tried to explain to the police that he needed to change the oil on his car and get the brakes on his car fixed, and that's what he was doing there that night. But when the police searched his car, of which he was totally willing to have his car searched, nothing needed to be fixed. His car was completely fine. He was questioned about the murders, and he was officially booked as being a suspect. Now, a few years went by and they were able to relocate him, and he was living in Sebring, Florida with his elderly father. This was in 1997. Now, within 3 days of them finding him, he was informed of his rights and he gave several statements that were recorded. Now, during this interrogation, he told the police that he frequented the sex workers throughout his life, like loved seeing them, hanging out with them, all the shebang, and that he claimed to know at least 100 of them. He also would talk about his extensive past with drugs, such as heroin, LSD, and crack. But he didn't talk about cocaine. We'll kind of talk about cocaine in a little bit. Now, he also talked about the police about a dream that he had. This dream was about a series of murders, and he would admit to going to the location of where the bodies were found, but he still maintained his innocence. Just a little sidebar, the locations in his dreams is actually some of the locations of where some of these remains were found. So this is why police were kind of like, oh, is he our guy? Like, come on. So within a few days of his interrogations being finalized and over, he was arrested for buying cocaine from an undercover police officer at his own home in Sebring. He was convicted and spent 85 days in jail. But now, according to his cellmates in jail, apparently he talked about the killings in New Orleans. One of his cellmates, Stan Hill, then contacted the prosecutor's office and talked about how Russell admitted to killing these women in the cell. Now, apparently, when they contacted him, he refuted all of this, but per Stan Hill, apparently, Russell admitted that he would offer these women large quantities of cocaine or drugs that would cause an overdose, and then he would strangle and dump their bodies. After Russell was released from jail, he was then tracked down again and reinterrogated. He denied all of these admissions, like I already said, and basically they were just straight up accusing him. Now, also according to a veteran police officer named Ron Camden, he said that when he questioned Russell Elwood, he had a confession from Russell Elwood on tape. And apparently, Russell said that he killed a black girl and then dumped her in her canal. That this is all on like a recording. But here's the thing, there was never a recording of Elwood saying this. Never. And he would then be released. But yet again, he would be arrested. This time was for speeding. This was a year later, in 1998, when he was in New Orleans. He decided to return home, basically. He was then convicted and sentenced to 120 days in jail, and when he was in jail, he also would be charged with the murders of Cheryl Lewis and Dolores Mack, which is the same area initially where they found him. That's where the bodies were found, or near where the bodies were found. So he would be found guilty of the murder of Cheryl Lewis due to very circumstantial evidence that they had against him, but the charges against him for the murder of Dolores Mack were dropped. He did receive life in prison without parole for the murder of Cheryl Lewis. So as of this day, only one murder has been solved, but the rest remain unsolved. Russell Elwood still stands as a suspect to this day, as does Victor Grant. The Storyville Slayer still remains a mystery for New Orleans. What are your thoughts? Leave them in the comments down below. I would love to know, and I will see you guys in the next video.